Dr. Vesic Thorne had delivered thousands of terminal diagnoses across a 30-year career spanning 4 systems, and every single patient had reacted the same way. Anger, denial, grief that poured out of them like water from a cracked vessel, every patient except one. 6 hours, Vesic said, standing over the medical bay's diagnostic table aboard the research vessel Kethlin's Reach, watching numbers scroll across a display that confirmed what his sensors had already told him twice. The radiation exposure was too severe. I'm sorry, Mr. Ackafer. There's nothing more medicine can do. Daniel Ackafer, 44 years old, chief engineer of a joint human-VOS research expedition mapping an unstable pulsar field, lay on the table with burns creeping up both arms from a coolant breach he had personally crawled into to seal, saving 11 other crew members in the process. He absorbed the doctor's words the way a stone absorbs rain, without visible reaction, his breathing steady, his eyes clear. "Can you get me a pen and paper?" he said. "Actual paper, not a data slate, actual pen." Vesic Thorne, who had spent 3 decades cataloging the varied and predictable ways that dying creatures across a dozen species faced their final hours, found himself utterly without precedent for this request. "Mr. Ackafer, I understand this news is difficult to process, but perhaps we should discuss." "I heard you the first time, Doc," Daniel said, not unkindly. 6 hours. I did the math already, same as you. I need paper, please." Something in the quiet, unshaken certainty of the request made Vesic Thorne pause his entire practiced routine of grief counseling, the routine he had refined across thousands of deathbed conversations on a dozen worlds, none of which had prepared him for a dying man's first and only request being office supplies. He sent an orderly to fetch what was asked. Real paper was scarce aboard a research vessel built around digital efficiency, but the ship's archivist maintained a small stock for ceremonial documents, and within 20 minutes Daniel Ackafer had a stack of cream-colored pages and a simple mechanical pen resting on a tray beside his burned and failing hands. He began writing immediately, his handwriting shaky from the tremors already creeping through nerve damage the doctors couldn't reverse, but legible, deliberate, unhurried despite the hour count ticking down somewhere in the back of both their minds. Vesic Thorne, against every protocol governing patient privacy, found himself unable to leave the room. He had never watched a species react to its own death this way, and 30 years of professional curiosity kept him rooted at the foot of the bed, watching a human write with the calm, focused intensity of someone completing an ordinary task on an ordinary day. "May I ask what you're writing?" Vesic finally said, an hour into the process, watching the stack of completed pages grow slowly beside Daniel's failing hand. "Letters," Daniel said, not looking up. "Got a wife back on Earth, 2 kids, a sister who hasn't spoken to me in 6 years over something so stupid I can't hardly remember what started it. Figure I got 6 hours. Might as well use them to say the things I never got around to saying when I thought I had all the time in the world." Vesic Thorne had processed thousands of deaths and understood death, clinically, as a cessation of biological function, a problem to be diagnosed and, when possible, prevented. He had never once considered death as something that could be used actively, deliberately, the way Daniel Ackafer was using his. "You're not afraid," Vesic said. It wasn't quite a question. Daniel paused his writing for the first time, looking up at the alien doctor with an expression that held more exhaustion than serenity, the honest weariness of a man who had already done his grieving somewhere private, before the paper ever arrived. "I'm terrified, Doc," he said quietly. "Been terrified since the second you said 6 hours, but being scared and wasting the time I got left ain't the same thing. I can be scared and still write to my kids. Being scared doesn't get to take that away from me too." He returned to writing, and Vesic Thorne, for the first time in 30 years of medical practice, found himself without a single word of professional wisdom to offer, Only the strange, humbling sensation of watching a dying creature teach him something about dying that no medical text on any of the 12 worlds he'd studied had ever managed to convey. Word spread through the Kethlans reached quickly, the way news always spreads on a vessel too small to hold secrets. Crew members began finding reasons to walk past the medical bay, glancing in at the human engineer who had saved 11 lives and was now spending his last hours filling page after page with careful, trembling handwriting instead of raging against the unfairness of it. Commander Rel, the Voss officer who had authorized the coolant breach repair that had cost Daniel his life, arrived at the medical bay 2 hours into his remaining 6, her composure, usually flawless, visibly strained. "Mr. Acaffer," she said, standing at the foot of his bed with the particular stiffness of someone unused to expressing emotions she hadn't planned for. "I want you to know the 11 crew members you saved are alive because of what you did. I wanted to say that before I'm not around to hear it," Daniel finished, and offered her something that was almost a smile. "Appreciate you saying it, Commander, but I already knew what I signed up for when I went into that coolant chamber. Didn't do it for thank yous. Did it because 11 people were gonna die if I didn't, and I figured that math wasn't complicated." Commander Rel stood there for a long moment, processing something that clearly did not fit neatly into her own species' framework for understanding sacrifice, before finally asking the question that had brought her to the medical bay in the first place. "Is there anything I can do, anything at all, for these final hours?" Daniel Acaffer looked down at the stack of letters growing beside him, 4 pages deep now, his handwriting growing steadily shakier but no less deliberate. "You could make sure these get delivered," he said. "Actual paper, actual delivery, not some digital file that gets lost in a server somewhere. My wife's gonna want to hold something I actually touched. That'll matter more to her than anything I could say in the letters themselves." "Consider it done," Commander Rel said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised even herself. The hours passed the way hours pass for everyone facing an ending, too fast and too slow all at once, and Daniel Acaffer kept writing. A letter to his wife, Amara. That took him 90 minutes and left tear tracks on paper that had started clean and ended, stained in a way that made the words themselves feel more permanent, more real. A letter to his son, 12 years old, full of advice about kindness and stubbornness, and the particular importance of learning both engineering and how to properly apologize when you're wrong. A letter to his daughter, 7 years old, too young yet to understand grief the way her brother would, written simpler, gentler, full of the kind of love that doesn't need complicated words to land with its full weight. And finally, 4 hours and 40 minutes into his remaining 6, a letter to the sister he hadn't spoken to in 6 years, the ink smudging slightly where his hand had begun to shake too badly to fully control, apologizing for a fight neither of them could quite remember starting, forgiving her for whatever she still believed she needed forgiveness for, refusing to let 6 years of silence become the final word between them. Vesic Thorn had never left the room. He stood at the periphery, monitoring vitals that continued their slow, inevitable decline, and found himself, for the first time in a 30-year career built on clinical distance, unable to maintain the professional detachment his training had spent decades reinforcing. "May I ask you something, Mr. Acaffer?" he finally said, somewhere in the 5th hour, his voice quieter than the clinical tone he usually reserved for patients. "In my species, when we receive a terminal diagnosis, there is a formal grieving period, a withdrawal from obligation, a turning inward. You've done the opposite. You've spent your final hours turned entirely outward, toward everyone except yourself. Why?" Daniel Acaffer set down his pen for a moment, flexing fingers that had begun to lose feeling an hour earlier, and considered the question with the same unhurried honesty he'd brought to everything since the diagnosis. "Because grief's not really about me anymore, Doc," he said. "I'm gonna be gone in a couple hours regardless of how I spend them. But my wife, my kids, my sister, they're gonna carry this a lot longer than 6 hours. They're gonna carry it for years. The only thing I got left that's actually worth something is making sure that when they do carry it, they've got something real to hold on to. Not just grief. Something I actually gave them on purpose with the time I had left. He picked the pen back up, his hand trembling badly now, and began a final page, shorter than the others, addressed to no one in particular. A page Vesic Thorn would only understand the purpose of much later. Being scared of dying is natural, Daniel said, half to the doctor, half to the page in front of him. But wasting the time you got left being scared instead of being useful, that's a choice. And I already made mine. I'd rather spend my last hours giving my family something to hold on to than spend it demanding sympathy from people who can't do a damn thing to fix what's already broken in me. The 6th hour arrived quietly, without drama, the way endings often do despite everyone's expectation that they should announce themselves with more ceremony. Daniel Ackafer finished his final letter with 11 minutes to spare, folded each page with careful, deliberate hands despite the tremors that had by then spread through both arms, and stacked them neatly on the tray beside him. "Commander Rel," he said, his voice growing fainter now but still steady, still entirely his own. "These go to my family, all of them, exactly as written, no edits, no cleaning up my handwriting to make it neater. They need to see it came from me, shaky hands and all. That matters more than looking polished." "I'll see to it personally," Commander Rel said, standing at his bedside now, her composed Voss features carrying an expression that would have been unthinkable to her 4 hours earlier. Daniel Ackafer died 9 minutes later, 7 hours and 42 minutes after Vesic Thorn first told him he had 6 hours to live, having spent every single one of those minutes exactly as he had chosen to, giving away what remained of himself instead of mourning what he was about to lose. The letters were delivered exactly as promised, 3 months later, when the Kethlins' Reach finally returned to a system with direct courier access to Earth. Amara Ackafer held her husband's final letter for a long time before she could bring herself to open it, and when she finally did, she found not grand declarations or elaborate final wisdom, but simple, honest words from a man who had spent his last hours making sure the people he loved would have something real to hold on to instead of an empty space where goodbye should have been. Vesic Thorn requested a transfer to Earth-adjacent medical postings less than a year later, an unusual career pivot for a doctor 30 years into a specialization in xenobiology across 4 other systems entirely. When colleagues asked why, he gave an answer that satisfied almost none of them, because it wasn't really an answer built for satisfying anyone but himself. "I spent 3 decades believing I understood death," he told them. "I understood the biology of it perfectly. The chemistry, the failure of organs, the precise sequence in which a body shuts itself down. What I never understood, until I watched a human ask for a pen and paper instead of sympathy, was that dying well isn't about biology at all. It's about what you choose to do with the time you have left, no matter how little of it remains." He kept a copy of Daniel Ackafer's final, unaddressed page, the one written to no one in particular, in his personal effects for the rest of his career, a single sentence that Daniel had written in his last steady moments before his hand grew too unsteady to continue. "Time is the only thing nobody gets to keep, so give it away on purpose, to people worth giving it to, before somebody has to do it for you." Vesic Thorn never delivered another terminal diagnosis without remembering those words, and never again assumed that fear and grace were opposites, because a dying human engineer with 6 hours left had proven, quietly and without any need for an audience, that a person could hold both at once and still choose, deliberately, to spend their final hours giving instead of taking.